elections, and I don't think you would see this on the test, but I think you've got to remember it, is that our election system it creates a two-party system. The fact that we have single member first past the post election for all of our members to the House of Representatives pretty much guarantees that we're gonna have a two-party system and not a multi-party system. Because you've gotta get the most votes to win any seat. There's no runoff in most of our, elections in the United States. No, that it's not a, coincidence that, or just some happenstance that we have that we maintain a two-party system. I think America has been reluctant to change that. Our founding fathers hoped that we wouldn't have any political parties. What did Madison call them? Factions, exactly. Today, when we use the word faction politically, we're talking about a group within a political party, like the Tea Party faction within the Republican Party, or the Blue Dog Democrats, who are a more conservative branch within the Democratic Party. That's what we mean by faction. But if we get a document from before 1800 and it says the word faction, probably it means a political party. Just read the context. A faction just means a group of people who believe alike, who have similar beliefs, usually of a political persuasion. Even though you can have factions within a church, or some other religious organization, or all kinds of things. We can have factions. We've got the Foursquare faction here at Scholars Academy,
Very
and
true.
those who aren't Foursquare. And so we have that. Does that make sense to everybody? All right.
That's good.
We have elections in this country going back to 1619, with the creation of the House of Burgesses in Virginia, 1619. That's just a good walking around kind of date to have in your head. We know that in colonial times, it was a pretty high bar to be a voter. I'm sorry, Caroline, if you
Here,
want to
I'll stand.
sit behind my desk, you're
Okay,
welcome
I'll sit at
to.
your desk. I was just like this.
Yeah, it's difficult, but I want to be up at my timeline today as I'm going through. But it was a pretty high bar for who could vote and who could not, particularly in southern states. The more opportunity there was for land ownership, the higher the land ownership requirements were. The idea was this: people who are not tied to a market don't need the government. They're not impacted by the government. That was what people of that day thought. We're not going to let all white men vote because all white men are not tied to the government for the most part. Think about a subsistence farmer living out on the frontier. They don't pay many taxes. They don't have hardly any day-to-day operations. Are we all getting that? Are we all paying attention to that? We will have property requirements for voting up until halfway through this period 4, about the age of Jackson. How do we end property requirements for voting in America? What method is used? Absolutely. It's mostly state by state. A lot of students want to say that Andrew Jackson created universal white male suffrage. That's wrong. Andrew Jackson benefited from universal white male suffrage. The Democratic Party during the age of Jackson benefited from universal white male suffrage, but they didn't create it. It was state by state. Last state to create universal white male suffrage. South Carolina,
Yeah,
absolutely. Also know that the first thing to go would be property requirements for suffrage, but it would often take many more years before we ended property requirements for holding office. And if you go back and look at colonial times, if you go back to the House of Burgesses in 1619, all the way up until the South Carolina General Assembly in the 1830s, you're going to see here's the bar for voting, and then here's the bar for holding office. We expected really rich guys to be able to hold office. There's one area that in time that is an exception to this rule about property requirements to vote, where another criteria was used to determine what men could vote. When and where? I'm thinking earlier. I'm not thinking
New
about
England.
race, and I'm talking about white men.
New England.
New England during the 1600s, during the 17th century. Absolutely. You had to be a church member to vote. And if you will remember in the early days of Puritanism in New England, it was hard to be a church member. You had to go through that conversion relation to vote. Does that make sense to everybody? Y'all remember the conversion relation where you're basically put on trial for weeks and weeks on end to make sure that you are one of the blessed, one of the, what was the word they used? One of the, you go into heaven. Elect. That you are one of the elect. And so that, you had to go through that, and then the church voted, those who were already church members voted on whether you got in as a church member. So it was quite difficult even then to be, we know that everybody in Puritan New England had to go to church. Church attendance was expected, sometimes legally, sometimes just by the society. But just because you had to go to church and just because you had to follow church doctrine did not mean you were a member of the church. What we begin to see is as we get to around 1700, a lot of things are diminishing the power of the Puritan church. So those go by the wayside, and by the early 1700s, you had to own property to vote and hold office in New England, just like in the Chesapeake. Has everybody got that? Any questions? Okay. I wouldn't be surprised to see a question that asks you to compare and contrast suffrage from one era to another. You just brought up how African Americans were denied the right to vote after the Civil War. You know those, thank goodness for South Carolina history, be able to list those. But what was by far, besides literacy tests, poll tests, grandfather clauses, white primaries, beside those things, what was the biggest thing that kept African Americans from voting? Intimidation, absolutely. So we know all of those things. We could follow the struggle for women's suffrage from 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention through, I've got it somewhere up here, 1872. The women are very angry about the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. They protest the government. Susan B. Anthony illegally votes and is sent to jail for a short amount of time. All the women's suffrage movement continues up until the 19th Amendment in 1920. So I think we could follow that, and then we could talk about the creation of, when did the Equal Rights Amendment get proposed and by whom? 1973. Not when did it get passed by Congress. When was it first proposed? In the 1920s by Alice Paul, absolutely. She'd gotten suffrage. She can't just go home and be happy with the right to vote. She proposes the Equal Rights Amendment. Good that you all know that it's passed by Congress in the early 70s. All right, I want to start going through. Miss Morrison's kids, if you haven't gotten one, I found online from another teacher a great chart that my students did this morning of the rise and fall. Casey's kind of showing it right there. I don't have any extra copies right now, but if you want a copy, I'll be glad to make you one to kind of go through and see, could you fill it out? I think it really kind of narrows this kind of immense amount of information down to kind of something that we can chew on and understand. All right. The first election for national offices in the United States were held in what year? When was George Washington elected president? 88. He was inaugurated in 89. Here's a chronology. Think about it. We write the Constitution in 87. Shame on anybody in here who doesn't have that date in their walking around knowledge. And for those of you that are like, shame on me, learn that one, okay? 1787. So then it doesn't get ratified until 88. Right, we have to send it back to the states, and they've got a battle over it, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, which is not a political party system, right? And then, so it gets ratified, and then we hold our first elections in November of 88. which means we inaugurate in '89, in the spring of '89. So just kind of know that. The first, I've written on the board some elections that you might want to know. Some of them are you like, oh my God, I never heard of that. That's okay. I mentioned in some of them, maybe not for the first time, but to remind you, some are big ones you really need to know. 1800, the revolution of 1800. The sitting president is who? Who's running for re-election?
Adams.
John Adams. He is a Federalist. He runs against a Democratic Republican, his former best friend, Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson wins. And that's why it's called the Revolution of 1800. Does that make sense? But something freaky happens in 1800. The Democratic Republicans get by far the most electoral votes. It's state by state. The Democratic Republicans around the country were very afraid at the shenanigans that the Federalist Party had been up to with the Alien and Sedition Acts and the quasi-war with France. They were really angry. But tell me, under the original Constitution, how did the Electoral College work? How is the vote taken? There's another piece of it, though, that we run into trouble. Under the original Constitution, each elector got to cast 2 votes. Because remember, our founding fathers didn't think we were going to have a political party, so they didn't plan for them. So they said each state is going to, or each state legislature is going to elect X number of wise men of sound decision making. And those wise men of sound decision making are going to cast their votes for the president. Does that make sense? Yeah? No? Got it? So Evan is an elector. The founding fathers didn't think he would have a political party, but they think that the South Carolina legislature would have chosen him because he's so wise and so sound and has the country's best interest at heart. So Evan goes to cast 2 votes. He says, I'm going to vote for, I don't know, Owen Mahood, and I'm going to vote for Connor Edwards. And that's the 2 votes he cast. Without political parties, right? That's how the founding, because you think those are the 2 best guys to vote for. Well, by 1800, guess what? We have political parties. And he's a Democratic Republican, and he is not casting it for the 2 best guys. He's going to cast it for the 2 guys that ran on the ticket, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, his vice presidential candidate. He knows he expects Thomas Jefferson to be president, Aaron Burr to be vice president. But that's not what the Constitution says. So he cast his 2 votes. And so do all the other Democratic Republican electors. Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr. Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr. Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr. Well, guess what? No one gets a majority. If Aaron Burr had an ounce of decency, he would have taken his name out. But Aaron Burr wanted to be emperor. Forget wanting to be president. He wanted to have an empire, right?
That's what Aarons do.
And so Aaron Burr won't take his vote out. And the vote, what happens when the Electoral College fails to have a majority of vote for one person?
It goes to the House of
It
Representatives.
goes to the House. And when it goes to the House, remember this, today we have 435 members in the House of Representatives. They don't each get a vote. Each state gets 1 vote. So our 7 House of representatives to the House, would have to come to consensus. That'd be an easy consensus because there's 6 Republicans and 1 Democrat now. But that's how it goes. Well, they go around and around and around, and remember, the House of Representatives hasn't changed over yet, so it's still decidedly Federalist, right? Finally, Alexander Hamilton says, oh my God, I hate Thomas Jefferson. He's horrible. Y'all have heard, y'all have seen the play Hamilton. You know how badly Hamilton hates Jefferson. But golly, Aaron Burr is a Fruit Loop, and we cannot have Aaron Burr as president. And so he shifts his, I'm not even sure he's in the House at that time. He may or may not have been, but he convinces the rest of the Federalist Party to cast their votes for Thomas Jefferson. As a result of that, we get the 12th Amendment. So now in the 1804 election, they've kicked Aaron Burr out. He's killed Hamilton by this time. And when Evan goes to cast his votes as a Democratic Republican, he's gonna cast one vote for president and a different vote for vice president. Does everybody get that? I put this up here, I don't expect you to memorize it or anything, but I think it's just a good kind of reference place. The last time a Federalist will run for president is 1816, right at the end of the War of 1812. The Federalist Party's over. They run this guy named Rufus King one more time. We could talk at length about whether the Federalist Party died out or whether it was absorbed in the Democratic Republic. Could y'all give evidence for both of those things? I think it dies out because it's an elitist party. It's a party for and by the elites. Second of all, they were seen as being unpatriotic after the War of 1812. They seem out of touch with this idea that we're going to expand. Most Americans want to expand. They just seem out of touch. They all of those things, the Hartford, Connecticut Convention, all of that. Give me evidence that the Democratic Republicans actually absorb the Federalists. The Second National Bank, yes, in 1816, absolutely. What else? Excellent. Increasing the power of the executive under Jefferson and Madison.
Louisiana Purchase.
Excellent, very good.
Oh,
No,
you said
no,
you're
yeah,
just
I'm
talking
sorry,
about
I wanted to say Louisiana Purchase because Jefferson did it without permission from Congress, so that is an extension of an expansion of presidential power, but it's also an expansion of an agrarian society. What about the protective tariff of 1816 as well? Don't forget those two events of 1816, protective tariff, Second National Bank. I'm gonna go on through elections, and then sometime between now and Friday morning, I'll go back to the charts you did today with the rise and fall. In 1832, we get our first nominating conventions. What's the political party that does the first one? Anti-Masons. The Anti-Masons. They are remember the Masons? Y'all have seen National Treasure.
The
Y'all have
Illuminati.
read all those books by Dan, the Da Vinci Code, that guy. Dan Brown, isn't that his name? Anyway, the Masons were a very elitist, secret organization. A lot of people believed that deep government was going on during that time. And so the Anti-Masons were an anti-elitist party in New York. They are not important for any reason on earth except they held a nominating convention. Instead of the party leaders getting together, 25 or 30 guys, to decide who the next candidate would be, each state, the party elites in each state, would get together and send delegates to a national convention, and there would be ballot after ballot after ballot until some sort of consensus was able to take place. That's democratizing. If you get a question about democratization during the age of Jackson, don't forget nominating conventions right there with universal white male suffrage and some other things that we get. In 1840, it's the first time that we really start using slogans and campaign icons, for want of a better word, to gain popular support. Why does a man like William Henry Harrison, an elite, he is an FFV, what's that? A First Family of Virginia, and he went west to make even a bigger fortune, went to Indiana, becomes a war hero at Tippecanoe, and now he's old and he's running for the president, and he has slogans, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Somebody made fun of him for being from the frontier and said he sits around in a log cabin drinking cider, and so log cabins and hard cider, which were kind of lower class things, become symbolic of his campaign. And I think that's where we get the irony of American politics, that our presidential candidates now have to be a man of the people. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes, no? Up until that time, only the wealthy voted. You wouldn't want to say hard cider and log cabins and have songs and marches and bands playing and slogans and all that stuff, because the lower classes didn't vote. But by 1840, we have universal white male suffrage, so you've got to appeal to the masses. And of course, our presidents still do it today. Donald Trump didn't. very much. But he was blasted by his opponents in the Republican primary for the way he was eating pizza at a campaign stop. How was he eating pizza?
With a fork and a knife.
With a fork and a knife, and oh my God, who eats pizza with a fork and a knife? And so we still want our presidents to be of the common man. Hillary Clinton going into a bar in Pennsylvania and doing shots with the coal miners or the steel workers in Pennsylvania, trying to show that she's one of the people. Very important. George, which one? I think it was H.W. Bush. One of them loved to talk about how much they loved country music and eating pork rinds, which are kind of, something the people do. He's from one of the oldest families in New England. He's as blue-blooded as they come. But very important. That starts in 1840. I love this election. You'll never see it on a test, but I love to teach it as a political science class. In 1844, there was a little party called the Liberty Party. It's one of our very first. It's one of our very first anti-slavery parties. There's several of them. It doesn't have widespread to take just enough votes away from the Whig candidate. Guess who the Whig candidate is? 1844. Henry Clay. If you got a guess, that's a good one to guess if it's a Whig candidate. And the Liberty candidate takes just enough votes away from Henry Clay to give New York's electoral votes to whom? Polk, James K. Polk. Think about how impactful that little irrelevant third party was to American history. What land do we get while James K. Polk is president? What? I can't hear you. Y'all are because you're afraid to be wrong.
Texas.
We annex Texas, we whatever you want to call it, steal it, buy it, annex the Mexican cession and the Oregon Territory. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gives us the Mexican cession. I cannot urge you enough to go into your textbooks, into the pageant, and learn that map. Gadsden Purchase. And it's just that little piece right here. So basically, under James K. Polk, we get everything that we have now to the Pacific Ocean, except that little strip of desert right there, which we buy from Mexico.
Had Henry Clay been president, would he not have been for that?
I absolutely, with all my soul, believe that a Whig president would not have provoked war with Mexico. I don't think he would have, even though he's from Kentucky and a Southerner and probably in favor of the expansion of slavery. He's also a Whig, and I just don't think he would have done that.
The land purchase, would that not have gone towards internal improvements?
What land purchase?
Well, not land purchase, but the land that Polk got, would that not have fallen under internal improvements?
No, because an internal improvement is a railroad or a canal or an airstrip or high speed internet or those kinds of things. This is going to once again make us more agrarian. It's going to have more farmers in America, and they tend to vote Democratic, not the Whigs. Does that make sense? Okay. So I just like that as an example of an almost irrelevant party that incredibly changes American history. You know the election of 1860, the Democrats split. We can no longer have a national party by 1860. The Whigs have died out. The last presidential candidate they run, I think, is in 52. They might run somebody in 50. I know the Republicans run somebody in 56. I don't remember if the Whigs do. They're irrelevant regardless. And the Democratic Party can't hold it together. You've either got to be free soil or expansion of slavery as a national party. We have 3 candidates run on various Democratic tickets. 3 Democrats run, and Lincoln obviously runs as a Republican. I'm going to finish these 2 and then you need to go. The African American vote is what gives Ulysses S. Grant the election in 1868, because remember, even though a lot of Southerners can't vote, a lot of white Southerners can't vote, those northern cities are loaded with poor people, and they vote Democrat as well. So the African American vote in the Deep South tips the scales, the electoral scales to Grant. The Republican Party says, "Oh, that was close. We want to make sure that African Americans can still vote," and they passed the 15th Amendment. This is an off-year election. Wait a minute. No, that's the right one. That's the right one. 1868. I'm right. Okay? Got it? It's not an off-year election. It's Grant. And then 72 is just that one where Susan B. Anthony voted, got arrested. You don't have to remember a date. If you're talking about the Gilded Age, you could say during one election during the Gilded Age, Susan B. Anthony and several of her followers voted, and several days later were arrested and sent to jail for a short sentence. Okay? All right. I hope to see you tomorrow.